Section 31 of 30 Days a Detective by Allan Pinkerton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Express Robber, Part 2. Several days passed on, and at the end of that time, the newcomer and Mr. Risley had become inseparable friends. They rode out together, they smoked their after-dinner cigars in company, and in the evening they would join with the others in their card-playing for small stakes, in which it almost invariably happened that Mr. Fowler and Mr. Risley were winners. Mr. Fowler had extended his circle of acquaintances, and had become quite popular with the villagers and the guests at the hotel. He also visited the express office and made the acquaintance of Mr. Adams, agent of the company, with whom he conversed about the robbery in the presence of others, and in a careless, good-natured manner offered his opinion that the thieves, whoever they were, must have been pretty smart fellows. This was said with a quiet smile, and with a sly wink at Mr. Risley, which greatly confused that gentleman and prevented him from replying. It was the general impression that the detectives had given up the task, and that no further investigations were being made into the affair. That the only thing to be done was for the gentlemen who had lost their money to await the opening of the spring term of the court, and to substantiate their claim when the money would be promptly refunded to them. Meanwhile, Mr. Fowler had interested himself to a very great extent in the oil speculations, which he had announced was the occasion of his visit to Grafton. He had repeated conversations with Risley, Meredith, and Marks, who often came to Grafton, upon the subject. He deeply deplored the delay to which Risley was subjected in receiving his money, and at length suggested a scheme that would probably obviate all difficulty. He would visit a number of his friends in the West, who were cattle drovers with means, and in company with Risley they would endeavor to interest them in the speculation, and if they succeeded in that, all further trouble about money would be successfully overcome. Risley eagerly consented to the proposition, and after making full preparations for their journey, the two men departed. They went together to Cincinnati and to Chicago, and saw various western cities, Fowler having a large acquaintance among men who were engaged in the droving business, introducing his friend to them, and wherever they went, they were hospitably entertained. It was arranged that Fowler should invariably broach the subject of the proposed investment, and that at a time when Risley would be absent. That Risley should be introduced to these men as being largely interested in oil and coal lands, which gave promise of large yields, but that he should not be understood as advertising his possessions, or as seeking for assistance in working them. Fowler would, therefore, report to his friend Risley the result of his conversations with his friends, all of which was of a character to inspire the hopes of Risley in the success of the schemes in which they were engaged. It soon became apparent that Risley was one of those happy-go-lucky fellows who was fond of a good time, and who would drink more than was good for him when in the company of congenial spirits. Mr. Fowler, too, laid aside much of his dignity, and frequently indulged in these little irregularities, which both of the old fellows seemed to enjoy very much. By this time they had become bosom friends, and had reposed in each other mutual confidences which drew them nearer together. One day Fowler returned to the hotel where they were stopping in Chicago, and found Risley in rather a mellow mood, impatiently awaiting his coming. He was not intoxicated, but rather in that peculiarly gracious and communicative mood which is produced by imbibing a trifle too much of strong water. "Well, old man, what luck?" was his first salutation as Fowler entered the room. "Pretty good today," answered Fowler in an easy manner. "Did you find anybody that wanted to invest?" was the next inquiry. "Yes, I found two, and if you only had your money now, we would be all right," said Mr. Fowler. "Well, maybe I have got some that will do just as well," said Risley, as he drew a large wallet from his pocket and threw it down upon the table. He opened the wallet and displayed to the gaze of his companion a bundle of bills, new and crisp, of the denomination of $100. "How will that do, old fellow, for a first installment?" he asked with a chuckle. "Well, that will do all right, I guess," answered Fowler, as he drew near to the table and took up the bundle of notes. As he did so, he noticed with a start that the notes were all issued by the bank whose name had been mentioned in my poster, and he felt certain that these could be none others than the notes stolen from the express safe at Grafton. The amount of them, which Risley had, amounted to $5,000. "You are a sly old coon," said Fowler, slapping him upon the back. "You did a pretty good job with the safe, and I congratulate you." Risley looked up into his companion's face, but seeing there was only a sly twinkle in the eye and a good-natured smile upon the lips, he burst into a loud and hearty laugh. Yes, he said, after his laugh was over. "We managed that pretty well, didn't we?" "I should think you did," said Fowler, "but we must get rid of these notes. They are well known and might compromise us, you know." "I know that," said Risley, "but how are we going to do it?" "Oh, I'll fix that," said Fowler with a confident air. "I used to deal in counterfeit money a little, some time ago, and I can fix this all right. I will give you other money for this, and then dispose of it in safety." "You're a pretty good sort of fellow," said Risley, "and just the kind of friend a man ought to have," and he reached over and warmly clasped the hand of Mr. Fowler. "Where's the rest of the money?" said Mr. Fowler. "We might as well dispose of the whole of it while we're about it." "Why, Marks and Meredith divided the balance, but they have been afraid to dispose of it ever since." "Well, you write to them. Tell them it will be all right, and they can either bring it on themselves or send it by express. I have friends here who will manage it to a dot." "All right," said Risley. "I'll write to them tonight." "Let me see," said Fowler. "I guess we had better have this done out of the United States. Suppose you write to them to meet you in Windsor, Canada, and then we will be perfectly safe." "That's a good idea," said Risley. "I'll fix it that way, and then we will be sure to be all right." That night he wrote to both of his friends, detailed the circumstances fully to them, and advised them to come to Detroit, when they would all go over to Windsor, and Mr. Fowler would give them other money for what they had. Risley was overjoyed at the prospect before him, and the friendliness he manifested towards Fowler became so demonstrative that it almost grew wearisome. However, in a few days they received a telegram from Marks and Meredith, signifying their acceptance of Fowler's offer, and stating that they would be in Detroit upon a day which they named. During the absence of Risley and Fowler, my operatives had kept close watch upon the movements of the two men who remained at home, Messrs. Meredith and Marks, but their carefulness was not rewarded by anything which appeared at all suspicious. Both of them attended to their affairs in a businesslike manner, and seemed to be entirely occupied by matters of a purely legitimate character. Upon the day, however, when Meredith sent the telegram to Risley, the detective was on hand, and after Meredith had left the office, the operative entered hurriedly, and approaching the clerk, said, "Mr. Meredith has just sent a dispatch, but he thinks he has made a mistake in it. Will you allow me to correct it?" "Certainly, sir," said the unsuspecting clerk, handing over the blank which Meredith had filled up. The detective carefully read the words, and having fixed them in his mind, handed it back, saying, "No, there is no mistake. Mr. Meredith thought he had named the wrong day," and then, thanking the clerk for his courtesy, he withdrew. He had very little time to spare, for the train was due in a half hour, and Meredith would no doubt take passage upon it. He was not disappointed, for soon Meredith appeared with a satchel, and purchasing a ticket for Wheeling, he entered the car. The detective followed him, and after reaching Wheeling, he telegraphed to Mr. Bangs the discovery he had made. Meredith soon met Marks, and the two operatives were thrown together, and that evening the quartet started upon their journey to Detroit. Messrs. Fowler and Risley had also left Chicago for the same destination, and the transfer of the money would soon, no doubt, be made. Each of the three men were congratulating themselves upon the happy chance which brought Mr. Fowler to Grafton in time to do them so great a service, and the detectives were active and alert for any developments that might be made. The two men, Joseph Marks and William Meredith, accompanied by their unknown and unnoticed attendants, arrived in Detroit just as the gathering twilight was throwing its darkening shadows over the city. They were met at the station by John Risley and Mr. Fowler, and the greetings exchanged were the most cordial. The two detectives were standing at a convenient distance, keeping the parties in full view, when they were accosted by another operative from my New York office. Without unnecessary delay, he directed them to repair at once to a hotel, which he named, and that he would take care of the gentlemen who were now conversing so good-naturedly together. Having been trained to obey instructions without asking unnecessary questions, the two men did as they were directed, and to their surprise they found the portly and imposing figure of Mr. Bangs standing in the doorway of the hotel. They could not account for his presence there in advance of them, and he did not enlighten them upon the subject. He requested them to come up to his room, and then, after hearing a full report of what had transpired, he gave them full and explicit orders as to their course of action. After all the arrangements had been duly made, Mr. Bangs, in company with the two men, left the hotel and proceeded in the direction which the persons they had been watching would naturally take in reaching the same house. They had not walked far when they espied the four men walking leisurely along, and apparently in great good humor. Risley was relating some of his experiences in Chicago, which were evidently of an amusing nature, for his friends laughed heartily at the recital. The detectives approached them, and, at a sign from Mr. Banks, the two men with him and the one on the rear advanced toward Risley, Marks, and Meredith, while Mr. Banks himself took care of Mr. Fowler. Before the four gentlemen could realize their position, a heavy hand was laid on each of their shoulders, and the stern voice of Mr. Bangs fell upon their ears. "Gentlemen, I demand your surrender for the robbery of the express company at Grafton, and an attempt to escape will be fatal to the man who makes the effort." There was no mistaking the resolute tone of that voice, and no evading the strong grip which each man felt upon his arm. Escape would be impossible, and they realized it at once. Besides that, their surprise was almost overpowering. Their laugh was still ringing in the air when they were thus accosted, and they had not yet recovered from the shock which the notice of their arrest had occasioned. Each looked at the other in hopeless dismay, and not a word was spoken until they reached the hotel. 4 rooms had previously been engaged by Mr. Bangs, and as they ascended the stairs, the curious eyes of the guests who were lounging about the hotel followed them on their way. 1 man was assigned to each room, a detective being delegated to guard each prisoner, and in a short space of time the lock of each door clicked behind them, and they found themselves shut in, with an officer of the law for a companion. Mr. Bangs had secured 2 communicating rooms in which to place Mr. Fowler and John Risley, as it was his intention that Risley should hear all that transpired between himself and Mr. Fowler. By a systematic course of questioning, which proved that he was fully posted as to the movements of the men who had been arrested, Mr. Bangs gradually induced Mr. Fowler to become communicative. Meanwhile, John Risley had crouched upon his knees beside the door, his ears strained to catch every word uttered by the 2 men in the room adjoining. With eyes glaring and with his hands clenched, he listened to what was transpiring, and when at length Mr. Fowler broke completely down and handed over the money which he had received, John Risley uttered a cry of agony, accompanied by terrible oaths, and threw himself upon the bed. Presently a knock was heard at the door, and as the detective opened it, Mr. Bangs and Mr. Fowler stood in the doorway. Silently they entered, and Fowler, going up to Risley, laid his hand upon his shoulder and said, "It's of no use, Risley. Mr. Bangs knows all about it, and we may as well give up." Risley started to his feet and gazed fiercely at Fowler. But as his eye encountered the steady, genial look of the other, his fierceness was gone, and he was plastic in our hands. He realized that subterfuge and untruthfulness could avail him no further, and he made a full and thorough confession of all the facts in relation to the robbery. From his statement, it appeared that Meredith first suggested and planned the robbery, and by his arguments and solicitations, Risley was finally induced to join in the attempt. Meredith furnished Risley with a lump of wax and explained to him the use of it, and one day, while both the agent and messenger of the company were outside, he quietly removed the key from the safe and in a few moments had a perfect impression of it in wax. Meredith then procured the blank key at Wheeling, and assisted by Marks, the instrument was made which so successfully opened the way to their robbery. The work was performed by Meredith and Marks after Mr. Risley had sent his dummy package from Wheeling, and the fact of the second package being there had not entered into their original calculations at all. When they learned of it, however, their cupidity was not proof against the temptation, and they secured both packages. One of them contained what it represented to do, $12,000, and the other a bundle of brown paper with a $50 national banknote upon the top, for which $15,000 was to be claimed through the courts of law. The confession of John Risley was most complete and full, and at its conclusion he, with tearful eyes, besought Mr. Bangs to deal as leniently with him as was possible. His gay demeanor had disappeared, and he whined piteously and begged for mercy. Mr. Bangs informed him that he would do all that he could for him, but that the matter would rest entirely with the court, before which he would have to be tried, and that he could promise nothing. After leaving Risley, Mr. Bangs proceeded to the rooms occupied by Meredith and Marks. Meredith was morose and silent. He seemed to have given up all hope and had resigned himself to his fate, but he declined peremptorily to make any statement that might incriminate himself. He was searched, and upon his person was found his share of the robbery, $4,000, all in the original notes which had been taken, and which he had hitherto been afraid to dispose of. In the meantime, Marks had been chafing like a caged tiger. Of an excitable disposition, he stormed and raved at the detective, and with terrible oaths threatened vengeance upon his captors. He walked his room impatiently, and his eyes flashed with anger and hate. He was no doubt a dangerous man when aroused, and the detective watched him carefully, lest he should make an attack upon him and attempt to effect his escape. When Mr. Bangs entered the room, he was received with curses and denunciations from the baffled thief, but his quiet, stern manner soon convinced the desperado that fuming would avail him but little, and that his threats were but idle breathings when launched at the fearless man who stood before him. The handcuffs were placed upon his wrists, and although he evinced a disposition to resist their application, a word of stern command from Mr. Bangs convinced him of the folly of such a proceeding, and he submitted with a dogged silence to the humiliating operation. His person was also searched, and his share of the transaction was found in the lining of his coat, $3,000, and thus the entire amount of the stolen property had been successfully recovered. Mr. Bangs returned to his room, where he found Mr. Fowler awaiting him. Grasping his hand cordially, Mr. Bangs exclaimed, "Fowler, you have managed this case admirably, and the success we have accomplished is mainly owing to your tact, energy, and intelligence." As the reader has no doubt already divined, Mr. Fowler, the elderly and gentlemanly cattle drover, was an operative upon my force who had been selected by me for this investigation, and through whose agency, acting under my instructions, the matter had been brought to a successful issue. The stolen money was now all in my hands, and the thieves were all under the watchful charge of my men. Risley's confession had been fully made and would be sufficient for the conviction of the prisoners. Thus far, all had been successfully accomplished, and nothing further remained to be done but to transport the discomfited gentleman back to Virginia. As a train left that evening, Mr. Bangs determined to lose no time in transferring his prisoners to the state in which the crime had been committed. Other matters were requiring his attention, and he was desirous of rendering up his charges to the proper authorities when his task would be ended, and he would be at liberty to devote himself to pressing affairs that required his individual services and presence. The prisoners were therefore handcuffed to their captors, the shackles being placed upon the right wrist of the prisoners and upon the left arm of their escort, and thus in couples, led by Mr. Bangs, the party proceeded to the depot, where, entering the cars, they were soon speeding upon their way to the scene of their burglarious exploit. Mr. Fowler, having performed all the duties required of him, returned to Chicago, where he was soon engaged upon an operation of an entirely different character. Without accident, the prisoners and their escorts arrived at Wheeling. Mr. Bangs secured rooms at a hotel for the party, and they retired to bed, each operative taking the precaution to lock the door of his room and to wheel the bedstead directly across the doorway to prevent any attempt at escape. For 3 days and nights these men had scarcely slept an hour, and entering their rooms they handcuffed their prisoners, and then throwing themselves on the bed without disrobing, they soon fell asleep. An hour afterwards, there were strange indications of wakefulness in one of the rooms. Joseph Marks, who had been strangely sullen and quiet during their journey, slowly raised himself upon his elbow and listened attentively to the labored breathing of his detective companion. Silently and breathlessly he listened, and at last, becoming satisfied that slumber had firmly bound the fatigued operative, he noiselessly slipped from the bed and stood upon the floor. Handcuffed as he was, he began quietly and by slow degrees to push the bedstead from its position across the door, pausing at frequent intervals to note its effect upon the sleeping man, but the deep, sonorous breathing of the sleeper gave undoubted proof that no danger was to be apprehended from him. After he had succeeded in moving the bed a sufficient distance to admit of the passage of his body, he searched the pockets of the detective and found the key. Without a sound, the bolt shot back in the lock, and freedom was before the criminal. Snatching up his hat and throwing his coat over his shoulders, buttoning it around his neck, he started for the door. As he did so, a movement of the sleeper aroused his fears, and hastening to the side of the bed, he assured himself that he was safe. Again he turned toward the door, and then, opening it noiselessly, he passed out, closing it behind him. Stealthily he glided along the corridors, and with cat-like steps descended the stairs. In safety he reached the street door, and in another moment he stood in the open air a free man. Raising his shackled hands, he shook them savagely in the direction of the building, and then, as he strode away, he chuckled to himself at the success which had attended him. Reaching the railroad track near the station, he found a freight train loaded with hay, and he climbed upon one of the open cars and hid himself between two bundles of hay. In a few moments he was rattling away from the scene of his captivity and from the company of his companions and their guards. When the exhausted detective arose on the following morning and found that the place beside him was empty and that his bed had been moved away from the door, he sat and gazed in a state of dazed stupor, unable to utter a word. Finally, as he recovered his scattered senses, he started quickly from the bed, and rushing directly to the room occupied by Mr. Bangs, he astonished that gentleman by his revelations. A hasty search proved conclusively that the bird had flown, and that expedition was necessary if his recapture was to be accomplished. Of course, this action on the part of my operative merited, and afterwards received, a just degree of censure, but I did not feel disposed to be very harsh with him because of the fatigue and exhaustion which he had suffered previous to his retiring upon that night. There are limits to the powers of endurance of human nature, and while regretting the temporary escape of the prisoner, I was disposed to be more lenient than under any other circumstances would have been the case. In order to be entirely untrammeled in the pursuit of Joseph Marks, Mr. Bangs at once surrendered his 2 remaining prisoners to the care of the city officials of Wheeling, and placed the $15,000 stolen money that had been recovered in the custody of a bank in that city. This being done, he began to lay his plans for the recovery of the fugitive. Obtaining the assistance of 2 men from the chief of police of the city, a vigorous search was at once commenced. It was soon learned that a freight train, the only one that had departed since the evening before, had passed through Wheeling shortly after midnight, and that it had stopped at the depot for a long time. It was a local freight train and made stoppages at all the stations along the road. From this, Mr. Bangs was induced to believe that Marks had availed himself of the mode of travel thus afforded him, and he thought it might be possible that he had left the train at the next station and had gone to his residence but a short distance away. One of the city officials, who was unknown to Marks, was deputed to repair to the vicinity of the residence of that individual and endeavor to ascertain if such was the case. Late in the afternoon, Mr. Bangs received a dispatch from this official to the effect that Marks was at home and that preparations were being made for a hasty departure. Mr. Bangs lost no time in getting his men together, and taking one of the city force with him, he took the train for Marks's house. It was 9 o'clock when the party started, and the clock of the village church struck 10 as they halted near their place of destination. The night was dark. Heavy clouds had been gathering during the day, and a slight shower began to fall as the party of detectives came in view of the house. The residence occupied by Marks was a pretty frame structure of the style of a Swiss cottage, surrounded by a beautiful lawn and numerous shade trees, and at the rear of the house was a large strip of woods. A low light was burning in one of the rooms of the house. Quietly the men approached, and after reaching a convenient distance, Mr. Bangs directed them to surround the building so as to prevent the exit of anyone from either side. When this had been done, he ascended the steps and knocked loudly upon the front door. Instantly the light was extinguished within, and all was darkness and silence. Failing to receive any response to his first summons, Mr. Bangs knocked again, and presently he heard hurried footsteps within the dwelling, and a female inquired in a trembling voice who it was that knocked. "Open the door," cried Mr. Bangs, unheeding the inquiry, "or I will force it from its hinges." A stifled cry came from the lady, whoever she was, and the sound of her swiftly retreating feet could be plainly heard. Again Mr. Bangs knocked at the door, this time louder than previously, and another female voice cried from within, "Wait a moment, and I will let you in." "Make haste," again cried Mr. Bangs. "I cannot be kept waiting any longer." As he spoke, the lock was turned, and the door was slowly opened. Throwing it forcibly back, he strode into the passageway, which was dark as Erebus. Drawing his dark lantern from his pocket, he threw its penetrating rays over the scene presented before him. The hall in which he stood was wide and capacious, extending the entire length of the building from front to rear, the door of the various rooms opening into it. Before him stood two pale-faced women, their eyes heavy with weeping, and their hands clasped piteously before them. He had no time to notice them particularly, and as he walked to the rear of the hall, he saw that one of the doors was open. Turning his lamp in that direction, he saw that the window in the rear was raised, and that a man whose body half protruded through the opening thus made was about to escape from the building. "Stop, or I fire!" cried Mr. Bangs. But at that instant, two stalwart arms from without grasped the shoulders of the man he addressed, and the cheery, confident voice of my operative replied, "All right, Captain, I've got him, and I guess I can take care of him." And with these words, the form of the man disappeared through the window. Rushing to the spot, my general superintendent saw with gratification that the discomfited Mr. Marks was in the strong arms of Henry Wilson, a brawny and careful detective. The prisoner made a desperate effort to resist, but a sturdy blow from the detective soon convinced him that such an attempt would be useless, and he sullenly resigned himself to his fate. The other men were called together. The prisoner was safely secured, and the successful and elated party returned to the station, where they took a train and soon after had placed their prisoner within the enclosing embraces of a prison cell, while a ponderous lock held him secure. On the following day, the prisoners were handed over to the authorities and were held to await their trial. Risley appeared to have broken down completely. His nerves were terribly shaken, and he seemed to feel deeply the disgrace which he had brought upon himself and his family. Meredith displayed the utmost unconcern and chatted with his keeper and such of his friends who visited him with great good humor. Marks, on the contrary, evinced a most belligerent disposition. He became almost savage under his long confinement. He swore loudly at everyone who approached his cell, and threatened a desperate vengeance upon those who had been instrumental in his arrest. During certain hours of the day, the prisoners were allowed the liberty of walking in the corridor, and during these times Risley and Meredith would converse in low tones upon their situation, while Marks held himself aloof from them and consorted with the other prisoners, with whom he soon became a great favorite. His dauntless spirit and fiery temper seemed to excite their admiration, and his threats of vengeance found a ready echo in the breasts of many more hardened, though less determined than himself. His influence soon communicated itself to the more reckless of the prisoners, and he became the center of a band of ruffians of all grades of crime. One day, after they had enjoyed the relaxation generally allowed them, and as they were about to be returned to their cells, the prisoners were alarmed by loud voices, as if in fierce altercation, and the powerful form of Marks was seen grappling fiercely with one of the keepers. This was intended to be the signal for a general mutiny among those with whom Marks had associated, but when the moment for action arrived, their hearts failed them, and they dared not perform their part of the compact. Marks was soon overpowered, but not until he had seriously injured the keeper, whom he had attacked, and he was conducted again to his cell. That night he made another attempt to escape, and in the desperate encounter which ensued, he was shot and killed. Thus ended, in a prison, a life which had been begun in honor and respectability, and a career that had hitherto won for him the confidence and regard of friends and of the community in which he moved. It was his first criminal offense, and the fierce nature, brooking no control, was chafed into madness by his disgrace and confinement. The trial of the two others, Risley and Meredith, was held, and the evidence against them proving indisputable, they were convicted. Risley, on account of his confession, was sentenced to only 3.5 years, while Meredith was sentenced to 15 years. Thus was the law finally vindicated, and the wrongdoers were compelled to expiate their crimes. From all that could be learned, Meredith had been remotely connected with several other incidents of a criminal nature, although he had thus far escaped punishment. Risley, on the contrary, had always prior to this lived an honest and respectable life. His family were all honorable and respected. He himself had once been a man of prominence and wealth. His voice had once been heard in the council of the state, and, but for this blot upon his fair name, the few remaining years of his life would have passed peacefully away, and he would have gone to his grave honored and revered. But temptation came, and the weak brain and speculative mind were not secure against the siren voice of the tempter. The possibility of suddenly and without danger accumulating riches was too powerful for his weak nature, and he yielded to the influences that had wrought his ruin. Our task was done. The stolen money had been recovered. The criminals had been punished, and leaving the prisoners to their better reflections, the detective enters again into other scenes which, while the world rolls on and humanity continues frail, will ever engross his mind and exercise his abilities. End of The Express Robber, Part 2. Read by Mark Harrington. Framingham, Massachusetts. End of 30 Years a Detective, a thorough and comprehensive exposé of criminal practices of all grades and classes by Allan Pinkerton.